The storm took the roofs first. That was the thing about a Category 3 coming ashore at high tide. The water got the headlines, but the wind got the shingles. And by the time the sky went that bruised yellow-green, and the last band swept out to sea, half the oldest street in Cedar Point was staring up at open sky through the attic vents. Dennis Rourke stood on his porch with a mug of cold coffee and counted the blue tarps going up one by one down the block, the way another man might count storm clouds. He had spent 31 years as a county building inspector before he retired, and he could read a roofline the way some people read a face. What he read that first week was fear. His neighbors were mostly retired, mostly on fixed incomes, mostly the kind of people who had bought their homes when the street was young and had never once thought about leaving. Now they were standing in their yards in the flat, gray light, phones pressed to their ears, listening to hold music from insurance companies that were already 3,000 claims deep and climbing. They needed roofs. They needed them before the next rain got into the walls and the mold started. And into that fear, right on schedule, rolled the trucks. They came in from out of state, a small convoy of pickups and a flatbed stacked with pallets of shingles still in the wrapper. The lettering on the doors said Coastal Premier Roofing, and the man who climbed out of the lead truck had a handshake like a car salesman and a smile that had clearly closed a lot of deals. He introduced himself up and down the street as Cody, just Cody, like a country singer, and he had a way of looking at a frightened 70-year-old widow and making her feel, for the length of one conversation, like the most important person in the county. Dennis watched him work for 2 days before he ever said a word to him. That was the inspector in him. You did not walk a job and start writing violations in the first 5 minutes. You watched. You let the site tell you what it was, and then you wrote it down. So he watched Cody go door to door with a clipboard and a tablet, and he watched the pattern, and the pattern was old as dirt. Cody was not knocking on every door. He was knocking on the doors with the wheelchair ramps and the grab bars and the flags for grandchildren in the window. He was choosing. The pitch, when Dennis finally heard it, was smooth as glass. Cody sat on Margaret Ellison's porch 2 houses down, a woman of 78 who had lost her husband the winter before, and he told her the truth in a way that made the lie invisible. The insurance companies were overwhelmed, he said, and that was true. The good crews were booking out 4 and 5 months, and that was true too. The rain was coming, and every week she waited the damage got worse and the mold got deeper, and that was as true as anything a man ever said on a porch. Then came the hook. He could get her to the front of the line, Cody said, because his crew was already here, already staged, already had the material on the truck. All he needed was a deposit to lock in her spot and cover the shingles. Because you understand, ma'am, with materials the way they are, we can't float that ourselves anymore. Half down today, half when we finish. He slid a contract across the little glass table, 3 pages, dense, and he tapped the signature line with a friendly pen. And Margaret Ellison, who trusted people the way people used to, wrote him a check for $8,000. He did the same thing 11 more times that week. Dennis kept a mental list at first, then a paper one, because 31 years of habit does not retire when you do. The Hendersons, both in their 80s. The Novak sisters, who had never married and had lived in the same house since Eisenhower. Ray Delgado, a widower with a bad hip and a Purple Heart in a shadow box by the door. 12 houses, 12 deposits, and the smallest of them was $6,000, and the largest was 11. By Dennis's arithmetic, standing on his porch with a pencil, Cody had collected something north of $90,000 from that one street in 6 days. And then the work started, and that was where Dennis's stomach began to turn for real. A crew showed up, sure. 3 young men who did not look like roofers and moved like they were being paid by the hour to look busy. They tore off shingles on the Henderson place, threw a layer of felt down, and left the ridge open to the sky. On the Novak house, they stacked pallets in the driveway and never touched the roof at all. They came late, left early, and every day there were fewer of them. Until one gray Thursday morning, the street woke up and the trucks were simply gone. No note, no call, just 12 half-torn roofs and 1 flatbed's worth of shingles slowly molding in the driveways, and $90,000 gone into the next zip code. The phone number on the contract rang 4 times and went to a voicemail that was full. The website was a template with stock photos of a family that lived, if they lived anywhere, in a suburb none of these people had ever seen. The physical address, when Ray Delgado's nephew looked it up, was a rented mailbox in a strip mall 2 states away. Coastal Premier Roofing had never premiered anything on any coast. It was a name on a magnet and a checking account that was already being emptied and closed. Margaret Ellison sat on her porch that Thursday and cried. And that was the part Dennis could not stand. Not the money, though the money was real and it was cruel. It was the shame of it. She kept saying she should have known. She was so stupid. She should have known. And Dennis wanted to take that man Cody and shake him. Not for the theft, but for the way he had made a good woman, ashamed of trusting the world she had spent 78 years being kind to. So Dennis Rourke did what he had done for 31 years. He got out a legal pad and a fresh cup of coffee, and he sat down at his kitchen table, and he started to build a file. Because here was the thing Cody had not bothered to check when he chose the oldest street in Cedar Point. He had not asked who lived at the end of the block. And the man who lived at the end of the block had spent 3 decades learning exactly how a fraudulent contract falls apart when somebody who knows what he is looking at finally reads it line by line. He started with the contracts. He walked the street, knocked on the 12 doors himself, and asked, gently, if he could photograph their paperwork. Some of them were embarrassed to show him. He told each one the same thing, quietly, standing on their porches. This was not their fault. This was a professional, and professionals were good at this, and the only mistake any of them had made was being decent. Then he took the contracts home, and he read them the way he used to read a set of blueprints that a developer swore were up to code. They were garbage, legally speaking, and beautifully so. Not one of them carried a state contractor's license number, which the law required to be printed on any residential roofing contract over a certain dollar amount. Not one of them contained the 3-day right of rescission notice that state law demanded on any door-to-door sale. Not one listed a bond or insurance carrier. The company name was registered nowhere in the state's contractor database, which Dennis checked from his laptop at the kitchen table, reading his glasses down his nose. Cody had not cut corners. Cody had built the entire thing out of corners. And there was one more thing, the thing Dennis kept coming back to. On his own house, Cody had made his single mistake. Dennis had let the man pitch him. He had sat on his own porch 4 days earlier and let Cody run the whole routine. The insurance line, the rain line, the front of the line, and Dennis had nodded along like a worried old man and asked good, frightened questions. And he had signed. He had signed a contract for $9,000 and written a deposit check for $4,500. And he had done it on purpose, with a small recorder running in his shirt pocket. Because in this state, you were allowed to record a conversation you were part of, and Dennis had checked that too. He had the whole pitch on tape. Every promise, every guarantee about timelines and licensing that was a lie the second it left Cody's mouth. He had the contract with no license number and no rescission notice. He had a canceled check because, unlike the others, he had made sure his went through, so the paper trail would be complete and traceable back to an account with a name on it. He had, in other words, done the one thing a man like Cody counted on nobody doing. He had made himself a victim on purpose so that he could be a witness with standing. The next morning, Dennis called a meeting. Not a mob, not a shouting match, just 12 neighbors and a plate of Margaret Ellison's lemon bars in his living room. Because even now she baked when she was nervous. He stood in front of them with his legal pad and he laid it out plain. He told them what they were not going to do first. They were not going to chase these men. They were not going to post their faces online and threaten them, because a threat was worthless and it warned the quarry. They were not going to eat the loss in silence either, the way Cody was betting they would. What they were going to do, Dennis said, was become the most boring, best documented complaint the state had ever seen. He handed each of them a page. He wanted every contract, every check, every text message, every voicemail, every photograph of the unfinished work with a date on it. He wanted Ray Delgado's nephew, who was good with computers, to pull the screenshot of the dead website and the rented mailbox address. He wanted it all in one folder, 12 stories that told the same story. Because one old woman complaining was a sad phone call, and 12 identical complaints with matching contracts was a pattern, and a pattern was a case. The first call went to the state contractor's licensing board. Dennis knew the intake process cold from the other side of the desk, and he knew that an unlicensed contractor operating after a declared disaster was not a slow-moving paperwork problem to those people. It was a live wire. Post-storm fraud was the thing every one of those agencies had geared up to hunt after the last 3 hurricanes, and a clean, organized packet with 12 victims and a recording landed on the right investigator's desk like a gift. Within a week, Dennis had a case number and a callback from a man named Harlan, who used to work code enforcement 2 counties over and knew exactly who Dennis was. The second call went to the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. This was the heavier hammer, and Dennis aimed it carefully. 12 elderly victims, targeted by age, in the wake of a federally declared disaster, by an out-of-state operator using a shell company and a rented mailbox. Every one of those words meant something specific to a consumer protection attorney. It meant deceptive trade practices. It meant elder financial exploitation, which in this state carried its own enhanced penalties. It meant, if they could find the man, real charges and not just a stern letter. And that was the piece Dennis had been quietest about, because he did not want to promise his neighbors anything he could not deliver. Finding Cody. The name on the contract was almost certainly not his real one, and the company was a ghost. But Dennis's canceled check was not a ghost. It had cleared into a real account at a real bank, and a real bank served with a real subpoena from a real attorney general would produce a real name attached to that account. The check Dennis had written on purpose was the thread, and he had made sure it was a strong one. For 3 weeks, the street held its breath and did the unglamorous work. Ray Delgado's nephew scanned everything. Margaret Ellison, who it turned out had kept every scrap of paper the man ever handed her, produced a folder so complete that Harlan the investigator later said it was the best documented victim file he had seen in 11 years on the job. The Novak sisters wrote out a timeline in a schoolteacher's hand, because one of them had been a schoolteacher for 40 years, and dates were her love language. 12 people who had felt stupid and helpless 3 weeks earlier were now, quietly, building the thing that would end this man. Dennis felt the shift in them, and it was the only good part of any of it. Shame is a heavy thing to carry, and the antidote to shame is not comfort, it is action. Every time Ray Delgado dropped off another dated photograph, he stood a little straighter. Every time Margaret found one more receipt, she apologized a little less. They stopped being 12 embarrassed old people who got taken and became, over the course of a month at a kitchen table, 12 careful witnesses who were going to see this through. The bank subpoena came back first. The account behind Coastal Premier Roofing belonged to a man whose real name was not Cody at all. And the account showed the same pattern in 3 other towns up the coast. Each one hit right after a storm. Each one a street of older homes. The man had a history. 2 prior operations under 2 prior company names. 1 civil judgment he had never paid. And an outstanding matter in a state 400 miles north that had never been able to serve him because he never stayed anywhere long enough. He was not a roofer who had gotten greedy. He was a professional who did this for a living, and he had been doing it, uncaught, for years, because his victims were exactly the people least likely to fight. He had never met a street with a retired inspector on it before. The contractors board moved first, because it could. Operating as an unlicensed contractor after a declared disaster, 12 counts, was enough to open a formal action, and the board issued a cease and desist and referred the licensing fraud onward. But it was the Attorney General's office, armed now with a real name and a real account and a pattern across 4 towns, that turned the screws that mattered. They filed deceptive trade practices, unlicensed contracting, and, in the count that carried the real weight, financial exploitation of the elderly, enhanced because every single victim was over 65. They found him in a motel 2 states away, staging for the next storm season, with a fresh magnetic sign for a fresh company already in the truck bed. He did not go quietly, in the sense that men like that never do. He had a lawyer within a day and a story about misunderstandings and satisfied customers. But the story did not survive contact with Margaret Ellison's folder, or the Novak sisters' timeline, or Dennis Rourke's recording, in which the man himself, in his own smooth voice, promised licensing he did not have and a bond that did not exist. There is not much a lawyer can do with a client on tape. The resolution, when it came, was not a movie. It was better than a movie, because it was real and it held. Faced with the recording and the pattern and the enhanced elder exploitation counts, the man took a plea rather than let 12 sympathetic retirees testify in front of a jury one after another. He pleaded to felony theft and to the deceptive practices counts, and the court ordered restitution, full restitution, every dollar of those 12 deposits paid back, plus the cost of the emergency tarping the neighbors had paid out of pocket while they waited. The judge, who had a mother the age of Margaret Ellison, ordered him to serve real time and set the restitution as a condition he would carry long after he walked out. Dennis drove Margaret to the sentencing himself. She wore her church dress. When the judge read the restitution figure into the record, and the man who had called himself Cody sat there in a borrowed jacket with his smooth smile finally gone, Margaret did not gloat. She reached over and took Dennis's hand, and she whispered that she was going to be able to fix her mother's roof after all. The roof on the house she had grown up in. And that was the whole of it for her. Not his ruin, her home. That was the difference between them, and it had always been the difference, and it was the reason the case was ever going to win. Here is what happened next, because you will want to know. The restitution did not come all at once, and it did not come easily. That is the honest part, the part the smooth stories leave out. But it came, garnished and monitored, dollar by dollar. And within 2 years, every one of the 12 had been made whole. The state used the case as a template. Harlan the investigator asked Dennis to speak at a training session for consumer protection intake staff on what a good post-disaster fraud packet looked like. And Dennis, who hated public speaking, did it anyway, because Margaret Ellison told him he had to. And the street got its roofs. That was the last piece, and it was Dennis's favorite. He found a local crew, a bonded, licensed outfit run by a man he had inspected fairly for 15 years and trusted. And he vetted the contract himself, line by line, license number and rescission notice and all. He walked every one of the 12 roofs when they were done, up the ladder at 71 years old, with his knees complaining the whole way. And he signed off on each one the way he used to sign off on a job. Because some habits are not habits at all. They are just who you are. Margaret Ellison's new porch light went on the evening the last roof was finished, warm and yellow against the blue dusk. And Dennis stood at the end of the block and counted the lights the way he had once counted the tarps. 12 of them, steady, up and down the oldest street in Cedar Point. The man who had chosen them, because they were old and kind and easy, had gotten one thing exactly backward. It was the old and the kind who had the patience to keep every receipt, the trust in each other to pull them, and the neighbor at the end of the block who knew precisely where a lie was written down. If you have ever been on the wrong end of a smooth handshake and a contract you did not fully read, you already know the feeling in Margaret's chest that first Thursday, and you know it was not really about the money. So let me leave you with the question the whole street kept coming back to at that kitchen table. Was Dennis right to sign that contract on purpose and let the man rob him just to build the case? Or was that too big a risk to take with his own savings on the line? Be honest about what you would have done. And I am always curious where you are all listening from tonight. So drop your state and your age in the comments, and tell me about the neighbor at the end of your block who quietly looks out for everyone. If this one kept you company today, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. And I will see you in the next one.